This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's everything you need to know about me right there. The podcast, though, well, I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about production stories, development stories, behind the scenes, bits and bobs, all those small little things that go to make the films that we know and love just that, the films that we know and love. Well, sometimes love. I've got a bit of an odd coupling for this episode, after all. What I do in the podcast is I take two films each week. I go into their stories. They tend to be fairly mainstream films, or at least with a mainstream leaning. They're also films I have some interest in. I try not to do snark. I'm not, if you like snark, that's fine. I'm not being snarky about people who are snarky. It's just I'm not very good at it, really. And I think it takes such a tremendous effort to make any kind of film. I kind of want this podcast to be more of a celebration of that. Without further ado, then, I'm just going to crack on, and I'm going to get to the first of the two films I'm talking about in this episode. I'm going right the way back to 1981. I'm going to play you a slightly extended clip from the trailer for the movie, and I'll get to the story of this one the other side of this.
Who can save Princess Juliet, held captive by the evil Count Lorca? Who can save the city? Who?
Report on this Condorman, on this man Wilkins. He's an amateur, do you hear? He is not an agent of the CIA. He is a writer of comic books.
Well, where to begin with that? We're back in 1981 for Condorman, directed by Charles Jarrett. Screenplay for this one, credited to Mark Sturdivant, based on a novel by Robert Sheckley, which I'm coming to shortly. IMDb list uncredited rewrites by Mickey Rose as well. The cast, led by Michael Crawford in the role of Woody Wilkins, Oliver Reed playing the villainous Krokov, and Barbara Carrera in the role of the Russian super spy, Natalia. Now, the setup for this one is Crawford takes on the role of Woody Wilkins, who is a man who draws and publishes his own comic strips, and he draws in particular, as you might expect, the hero Condorman. Not only does he draw him and publish him, though, for reasons best known to Woody Wilkins, he creates a Condorman suit that at the very start of the movie, I'm going as spoiler free as I can, but at the very start we see him trying on this suit and launching himself from the Eiffel Tower for reasons best known to him, really. Plot carries on and he becomes involved with the CIA for reasons I'm going to leave you to discover, which is then when he comes into contact with the character of Natalia. It seems really odd looking back now that this got through the studio system at all, but nonetheless gather round and let's have a look at the story, because this one followed in the aftermath of the success of Superman, the first Superman movie in the late 70s, directed by Richard Donner, starring the late great Christopher Reeve, of course. Superman 2 was shot around the same time as Superman, and well, shot at the same time, but then all sorts of shenanigans with that particular production, which I'm sure I'll come to Superman 2 in a future podcast. Bottom line, though, was when a superhero film hit big, well, Hollywood then, as with Hollywood now, when it sees a new trend, when it sees a bandwagon, it wants to jump aboard. Thus, studios were interested in comic book characters for the first time in what felt like a generation. So Disney, rather than licensing a comic book character, it sort of went down the route of inventing its own, and it used one or two of the Superman team to help it on its quest. So the story origins of Condorman do nonetheless go back to a 1965 book by the name of The Game of X. This was penned by the author Robert Sheckley, and notably, it didn't have Condorman in it, and tonally incredibly different from the film. If you think of the way Die Hard the Die Hard franchise used to take scripts that weren't originally Die Hard scripts and turn them into Die Hard scripts, this seems to be the Condorman equivalent of that. That Sheckley's book told the story of a top secret agent who's accidentally recruited and believes himself to be the best in the world. Well, that's what that became the guts of Condorman. So a screenplay was put together, and Disney was then on the lookout for a director for the picture. It settled on a Canadian helmer, Charles Jarrett, with whom it had a relationship before. Jarrett at this point was best known primarily, I'd suggest, for the films Anne of the Thousand Days and Mary Queen of Scots, the latter of which earned 6 Academy Award nominations. He was hired for the movie, having worked with them initially in the mid-70s on a film called Pit Ponies. He gave an interview to Reeling Back before his death where he talked about how Disney in the 70s had been, quote, trying to reach a much wider audience. Seems remarkable, that quote now, given Disney's dominance of the entertainment space. But he added that in recent years the studios made an effort to find directors with fresh approaches to family filmmaking. Thus, Jarrett fitted that bill and he got the call for Condorman. Now, he was making 2 films pretty much back to back for the studio, given that he also directed 1980s The Last Flight of Noah's Ark, which was produced by Ron Miller, and his name is going to come up shortly because he also was not only heading up the Disney studio at this point, he would serve as executive producer on Condorman as well. Now, in terms of casting the film, Michael Crawford at this point had sprung to fame in the 1970s, the BBC sitcom Some Mothers Do Have Them, and the key to that, particularly to the producers of Condorman, was the fact that it involved so much physical comedy, so much physical work that was done in camera. It's 1970s on a BBC budget. There was no faking it. Crawford did the stunts that you see in that show, some of which remain pretty legendary, really, that even though there are elements of the show that in a modern context seem pretty troubling, the actual physical performance of Crawford in the role of Frank Spencer is hard to quarrel with. So he had been that show had earned success overseas, and he'd been off to Australia. He talks about this in his memoir, which he published back in 1980, and he'd been away in Sydney. He came back to London and found that Disney had sent him the script for the film, and he was told at this point that it was a spoof of the James Bond movies, and he, as he recalled in his words, he said he was excited about working with Disney. It was a big deal to work for the studio, and also with director Charles Jarrett, that Crawford in particular cited that he was a huge fan of films Anne of the Thousand Days, Mary Queen of Scots and The Dove as well. So Crawford was interested, and he got called to Los Angeles to do a screen test for the role of Woody Wilkins, and in his words, quote, against all the odds, he chose me for the part, he being Charles Jarrett. The role of the role of Natalia, taken by Barbara Carrera, well, she had a background in modelling, and the glamour really was part of what Disney was looking to bring to this project. That one of the intentions with Condorman was to go a bit further than usual than Disney ordinarily was associated with. Hardly going rampant, but Disney president Ron Miller, who just talked about before, would tell the Wall Street Journal around the time of the film that the character of Natalia was, quote, the sexiest in Disney's history. That man never saw Robin Hood. There's no sexier Disney character than Robin Hood, surely. So then it was on to, with the core cast in place, with Oliver Reed then cast as the villain of the piece, it was on to putting the guts of the film together. And this involves some intense pre-production work, not least because a comic strip and a comic character needed to be created. And this was done specifically for the film. There wasn't previous material to draw on. And so Disney turned to an artist by the name of Mike Sekowsky, who wasn't ultimately credited in the end. His background, well, his extensive background in comics, including originating the Justice League heroes for DC. He didn't invent the characters, but he helped put them all together, and he's credited with Gardner Fox as basically being the co-creator of Justice League of America, introduced in 1960 in The Brave and the Bold issue 28, if you want me to be exact about that. Sekowsky then, who also had a Hanna-Barbera background, he'd never drawn illustrations for a feature film before, but that was the job that he was given. And pretty much all of the illustrations that you see in the film are his work, that he drew character sketches that you see. He drew mock front covers. He drew the comic strip. And Bird People magazine did an interesting piece on this, where it talked about just how extensive the amount of work he did for the production was. If you go on the D23 website as well, you can see an awful lot of concept art that cropped up a few years ago for Condorman, not least some of the costume design stuff. And clearly before, and it's not uncommon, but before this one got to production, there was a lot of development and concept work that was being done. Another artist by the name of Russ Heath would come and join Sekowsky later on to do the syndicated comic strip that was released in conjunction with the Condorman movie, but I'll come to that a little bit later. But it's worth noting that neither of them got credit for their work. It wasn't a great era for comic book writers and artists getting full credit, and they were caught up in the midst of that. It's not as if Disney was doing this on the cheap either. We're at the start of the 1980s, and there's a production budget for this one of $14 million to make the movie. To give that some context, that was roughly around the same price, $1 million or $2 million either side, as the cost of the Cannonball Run that was being made around the same time for 20th Century Fox. In the case of Condorman, this was going to be a bit of a globe-trotting enterprise. It was going to mirror to a degree James Bond. I mean, the James Bond film For Your Eyes Only was shooting roughly around the same time as well. Condorman thus would go from Switzerland to London to Monaco to France for its exterior work, and in London for Pinewood for its studio-based filming. Oliver Reed then was notorious for being quite difficult to work with, and also sadly for his illness with alcoholism as well, and his drinking was pretty intense around this time of his life. To give an example of what it was like working alongside him, and Crawford recounts this story in his memoir, there's a sequence where he and Barbara Carrera are in a helicopter, and Carrera needed to elicit fear. That was the emotion her character needed to put across at a given time. But Reed, a bit of a perfectionist, wasn't utterly convinced by the work that she was doing. Thus, he went a bit method on her without telling her, and promptly opened the helicopter door with Carrera not expecting it, and the look of fright that you see in the final movie is legitimate. Likewise, you might just be able to catch, as the story goes, the bit where she gives him an elbow in return and he winces with pain. Crawford also tells the story too that after one night of refreshments and sherbets, Oliver Reed decided to throw his costume for the film into the sea from his hotel room, basically the cost-conscious production manager would wade in to retrieve said costume rather than them forking out for another one. As Crawford told Broadway World in an interview, he would do terrible things. Then we did Condorman together, in which he got in terrible fights with people. He was a character and three quarters. But as you can glean from that quote, he had worked with Oliver Reed before on a production of The Jokers, where he played Reed's brother. And Crawford would say, quote, "The only thing that saved me, the filming together and having that previous relationship was, quote, the only thing that saved me when the Turvers filmed Condorman." Now, Reed, on the whole, was fairly friendly with Crawford on the production of the movie, would give him big hugs, and they'd be quite chummy. But then there were also moments, such as they were on location and Reed went into the room where Crawford was going to sit and turned all the beds upside down except Crawford's and just simply walked out, and that was that. As the production continued as well, Reed would go more and more method, and his character was Russian and he would speak more and more and more with a Russian accent. One night coming back from drinking, he encountered Crawford and invited him for a drink. Crawford went along for just the one, but it was on this outing that Reed called him for the first time the Feathered Fart, and that was the name that basically caught on for Crawford on the set of the movie, that he was called Condorman the Feathered Fart. For Crawford, it's worth noting that this was his first big movie lead role, and he was determined to throw himself into it in much the same way he had with the role of Frank Spencer, and that meant doing as much of the stunt work as he could himself. He nearly came a cropper on this one, though. There's a sequence in the movie where he falls into the River Seine in Paris, and the currents of the river were stronger than anticipated, which threatened to drag Crawford underwater to the point where it took lifeguards jumping in to save him and bring him back to safety. That said, ever the professional, he was willing to do the next take and have another go at the shot, but director Charles Jarrett overruled him on this one, and in came a stuntman to do the next take instead. Now, in terms of the Superman crossover, there's a fairly big one with the employment of special effects supervisor, legendary really, Colin Chilvers, for his work. He'd just won an Oscar for Superman, and he'd overseen the flying rigs on that movie, the whole "You'll Believe a Man Can Fly." And so with Condorman shooting at Pinewood, which is where Superman and Superman 2 had filmed, the thought originally was that they could adapt the flying rigs that were used on Superman for Condorman. However, this brought with it a problem in that the physical, basically the physicality of Michael Crawford and Christopher Reeve, who played Superman, of course, was different. That their body shapes were different, and so at first they tried to get Crawford into the moulds that had been made to fit Christopher Reeve's physique, but it was never going to happen. So in the end, they had to make the new moulds. In the end, those flying sequences were still done in Pinewood, but it took a little bit more rebuilding than they originally thought. Remy Julian, meanwhile, was in charge of the stunts, and he'd been working on the Bond movie For Your Eyes Only, an extensive career in stunt work as well, not least including the Italian Job. And one of Condorman's big sequences is a huge intensive car chase that takes place with Michael Crawford's Condor car and 5 black Porsches, which are said to be carrying KGB agents. This chase takes place against the backdrop of the Alps as well, throws in flamethrowers, you get jumps in there, you get rockets, and this was an intense, physical, demanding part of the production that took a 16-person crew to be able to shoot. Everything you see was done for real. Likewise, there's a boat sequence which involves a hydroplane which had to be custom made for the film. A hydroplane which you won't necessarily get this when you watch it, and I rewatched the film in the run-up to recording this podcast, but the hydroplane could do 85 miles per hour in real life. Again, let's put this into some kind of context. The Batmobile in Tim Burton's 1989 Batman could do, 30-40 miles per hour. That's as fast as it goes. Michael Crawford's Condorman hydroplane could do double that. Chilvers also oversaw as the press book. It's worth, if you search YouTube for a channel, Cinemology 101, they uploaded a guided tour basically of the press book for Condorman, and I learnt from that Chilvers was employed, you have to zoom in quite hard to see it, to do quote dozens of comic book style gimmicks. That there are lots of little things in there that were under Colin Chilvers' purview to do, and so it's stuff like the jets that you see on the tram cable as Crawford's Woody Wilkins shoots up at great speed, shoots up the cable at great speed. I'm not implying anything there. Likewise, there's just small things in there. There's a truck that turns into a race car. That was physically done as well, and just little gadgets here and there that call back to James Bond. He was overseeing those too. It's worth noting as well that Henry Mancini, the legendary composer, did the score for this one, including the theme tune and the title song, which once you've got that in your head for a day, you try losing it. Production took place between the spring and summer of 1980, and it wrapped up ahead of post-production work that would have a little bit of time to do. That the release date for the movie, it was set for the summer of 1981. Unusually for a film backed by American money, it was coming to the UK first. That the US release of this one wouldn't happen until the 7th of August 1981. In the UK, it would be the 2nd of July. We get it about a month before. When it came to the release of the film, though, Disney really wanted a big hit. I think there's a parallel here with Dick Tracy, which would follow a decade later. I've done a Film Stories podcast on that, in that it spent big contextually at the time to promote the hell out of the movie and try and turn it into something of a comic book movie event. There were lots of things now that we take for granted were done that were far less common back in 1981 as the film approached release. In particular, there's a special ice cream that was created to tie into the film as it was trying to target family audiences. This was done by Baskin-Robbins. At ice cream stores, 2 million posters for Condorman were given away too. Disney spent big. They spent on radio commercials. They had balloons that they were giving away. They had Sunday supplement adverts, point of sale displays. They had a collectible Condorman minicar, a tie-in paperback book. Competition ran to come up with as many bird title films as possible. It flew to pictures of Condorman on a Goodyear blimp that was hovering over events such as the Indianapolis 500, the US Open Golf, other PGA golf tournaments, and the America's Cup race. It wanted this at a point where the event movie hadn't really happened, although Jaws and Star Wars were out. The idea of the big event as we know it now wasn't quite as well formed, but it wanted this to be a big thing. A part and parcel of that was getting people to buy into the mythos and the whole character and the world of Condorman. As such, it took the unusual step, and you're hard pushed to find many other examples of this, of commissioning a 20-week comic strip that would be syndicated in newspapers around America. And this is the comic strip that was drawn by Russ Heath. And thus, Condorman, which began life as a fictional comic strip in a film, well, it became a real comic strip which then ran in American newspapers. The problem they hit, though, was it was quite hard to identify just what the film was. It's worth looking at the official tagline on the post that came out, which described the movie as, quote, an action-adventure romantic comedy spy story. And I think that's a fair example of how to hedge your bets. It couldn't really tie down whether it was a comic book movie, a superhero film, a James Bond spoof, a caper, and even though it was a bit of all of those ingredients, the fact that it couldn't quite settle on what it wanted to push meant that Disney had really struggled to market the film. It was coming out at a point as well where the box office had been in the doldrums for quite a while, and yet the summer of 1981 would be a huge turnaround for Hollywood movies. And I found an article for the New York Times around the time that just after Condorman had come out, and it said that Superman 2, which came out that summer as well, crossing $100 million at the box office following Raiders of the Lost Ark that had done it a few weeks before. It took a long time for films to get to that 100 million mark, but it was, quote, a joyous confirmation that a box office slump that lasted 2.5 years had ended with the biggest summer in the history of the movies. That's how big it was at that point. Raiders of the Lost Ark, The Cannonball Run, Stripes, For Your Eyes Only. These films had all come out and had done really impressive business. The flop of the summer, if you like, was a car chase comedy by the name of Honky Tonk Freeway from legendary director John Schlesinger. That had cost Universal Pictures $24 million to make and grossed just $2 million in return. And again, as the New York Times noted, quote, on its second Friday night in Las Vegas, playing exclusively in one theatre, Honky Tonk Freeway sold only $169 worth of tickets. And it was in the list of these disappointments that Condorman was mentioned too, because when the movie was released, it was critically lambasted and pretty hard, that in spite of Disney trying to push this as a big family superhero movie, Condorman really struggled both to win over critics and to find an audience. In fact, by the time all the marketing and distribution costs had been factored in on top of the production costs, Disney was said to have lost the best part of $10 million on Condorman in a year that was not particularly successful for the studio, even as others were making plenty of hay. Again, to give you some context, the other disappointments it was listed alongside by the New York Times were Outland, Zorro the Gay Blade, yep, that was a thing, Dragon Slayer, and Victory, better known to us as Escape Victory in the UK. It's certainly interesting looking back at the film now, though. There's a website called 13th Dimension, which I think really gets the nub of one of the things that doesn't quite work about the movie, even though I find it an awful lot of fun, because it noted that for a film called Condorman is barely in it, and I can't help thinking that Condorman is the Dark Knight Rises of its time. Disney had planned to make Condorman 2, such was its level of confidence in the feature and the project. Plans had begun, but those plans were abruptly stopped when the box office tallies for the movie came in. Condorman was going to be a one-off and has remained a one-off, even though there was talk at one point of a possible remake or reboot of sorts, but it was never really going to happen. It was a few years ago. For Michael Crawford, though, the turning point in his career, the latest turning point, would follow shortly afterwards when he got a call about doing the London run of a brand new musical by the name of Barnum. That would set him on the path which led to Phantom of the Opera and a whole other tier of fame and appreciation for his work would build from that point. As for those of us who still really enjoy Condorman, well, it's quite hard to get a decent release of it. That it has been released in DVD in the UK on a barren disc that doesn't look particularly special, unless some enterprising third-party company picks it up and is willing to put in the time and effort to do some extras on it. And we've sadly lost director Charles Jarrett now. I think that's about the best we're going to get. It's amazing, though, that it happened in the first place, and if you do want that score from Henry Mancini, that at least got a special CD release in 2012 courtesy of Intrada Records. I do recommend seeking that out and the film. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. This is the bits where I just ask for a favour or two, if that's okay. I'm a wholly independent podcast producer. I don't have any company behind me at all, nor do I have bags of cash or anything as luxurious as that. Thus, word of mouth is the only way that this podcast spreads. If you do like it, please do subscribe at your podcast repository of choice. Please do tell lots of people, and please, if you can, leave ideally a hugely positive review as well. All of this stuff is gold dust to me. During this period of lockdown, which we're still just about in as this is being recorded, I've been extending the offer of free advertising slots in the middle of the podcast to independent productions, to independent podcast producers, independent movie makers. So I'm just going to stop just for a quick message or two. If you want one of these, find me on Twitter at Simon Brew, send me a direct message, we'll take it from there.
My name's Em. You're listening to an excellent podcast right now about the stories of film. I also host a podcast. It's called Verbal Diorama, and it's all about the history and legacy of movies you know and movies you don't. Considering you have a vested interest in cinema, it might be right up your alley. Just search for Verbal Diorama in your podcast app. Catch you later, Film Stories listeners.
The coronavirus crisis makes it impossible for The Big Issue to be sold on the UK streets. We're still financially supporting vendors, but The Big Issue is about more than just money. That's where the Big Issue podcast comes in. Each week of the lockdown, we're celebrating the friendships inspired by The Big Issue. To find out more, go to bigissue.com/podcast.
And I'm back. I'm going straight into a clip from the second of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode. We're going to 2006, and I'll tell you the story the other side of this.
On principle, I can't negotiate with these people.
Well, then you know what needs to be done.
We're going to protect our citizens.
Make no mistake, my brothers. The humans will draw first blood. The air is still, and the night has fallen. There's only one question you must answer. Who will you stand with?
I'll stand with myself, Tar. That was a clip from 2006's X-Men The Last Stand, the third X-Men film, directed in the end by Brett Ratner, written by Simon Kinberg and Zach Penn. The cast, well, it's a big one. Hugh Jackman, Halle Berry, Ian McKellen, Patrick Stewart, Famke Janssen, Anna Paquin, Kelsey Grammer, James Marsden, Rebecca Romijn, Vinnie Jones, Ellen Page, Ben Foster. The cast list could fill a podcast. This should have been a far more straightforward tale than it actually turned out to me, because in the aftermath of the success of the first two X-Men films, in particular X2, the excellent sequel, that it was a no-brainer that they were going to press ahead with a third X-Men. The first had come out in 2000, the second had come out in 2003. The plan was then for the third to come out in 2006 and to keep that gap between the movies. And so there was a problem up front in that the cast had been, it's easy to overlook just what a huge gamble the first X-Men film was, and 20th Century Fox had signed up the cast to 2 movies at that point. So straight away it was going to be a more expensive production because the cast had become superstars, quite a few of them had, not least Hugh Jackman, and the price tag for the acting talent was going to go up. Bryan Singer, I mean, this is a story that involves some directors of whom serious allegations have been made against, so I'm just going to have to go with that and just tell the story, but acknowledge those allegations have been made. He was the incumbent director. He directed the first 2 X-Men films, and the plan was that he would do the third. Now, 20th Century Fox was so keen to work with Singer that at the end of 2003, in the aftermath of X-Men 2's success, it signed Singer to an overall development deal at the studio. It's the first of its kind for Singer and his new production company, Bad Hat Harry. And as Fox said in a statement, the deal is an outgrowth, there's a word, what's an outgrowth, of the strong relationship we built on those 2 films. Now, at this stage, Michael Dougherty and Dan Harris, well, they were recruited back to write the screenplay for the third X-Men movie. Worked on the second with the likes of Zach Penn and David Hayter, and the plan then was to have it up filming in Australia by the end of 2004. But it wasn't to be, because it became clear in the spring of 2004 that there's some toing and froing going on in the mind of Bryan Singer about what project to direct next. That he had 3 films on his slate and he had to choose what was he going to do. So under that development deal with Fox, there was X-Men 3, but also there was a long-mooted remake of Logan's Run that was drawing his attention, and Warner Brothers was on the lookout for a director for its Superman reboot. Now, the story of Superman Returns, which I'll come to in the future, is a labyrinthine one in its own right. McGee had been attached to direct that. Then Francis Lawrence, off the back of Constantine, well, he was in the running for Logan's Run. But when McGee quit Superman, Warner Brothers scrapped a screenplay that J.J. Abrams had written for that Superman film. It wanted to move quickly to get the Man of Steel back on the big screen. It had already got Batman Begins on the stove for release in 2005. It wanted Superman ideally for the year after that. McGee had already replaced Brett Ratner on the Superman film, but he'd quit. He had commitments to making the second Charlie's Angels movie, but this story is an X-Men story, and the bit that matters here is that Bryan Singer opted to jump. Notwithstanding the fact that he'd signed that deal with Fox, he signed it with Warner Brothers to direct Superman Returns, and suddenly Fox needed a new director, in spite of believing what it had was a longer-term commitment from Singer. Singer took his quite a few creative people, editor John Ottman, for instance, who recently won an Oscar for Bohemian Rhapsody, writers Michael Dougherty Muschietti and Dan Harris went with him to Superman Returns, and Fox would terminate Singer's development deal pretty much pronto in the aftermath of all of this. But what also went when Singer went was the planned story of Jean Grey's resurrection. That was going to be one of the central focuses of The Last Stand, and it would be fair to say in the final cut it really wasn't the central focus. There had been a plan to bring in Sigourney Weaver in the character of Emma Frost, and as Singer would reveal at 2006's San Diego Comic-Con, when ironically he was promoting Superman Returns that was coming out pretty much against X-Men, he only ended up writing a third of the treatment for X-Men 3, and that would have been the Dark Phoenix story. But going back to him vacating the director's chair, a new Helmer was going to be needed. Now, a new deal had been agreed with Hugh Jackman to reprise the role of Wolverine, and the vast majority of the cast were keen to return as well. I'll come to a little story on that in just a second. But Jackman's contract also gave him director approval, and it'd be a decade or so, no, about 5 or 6 years later, that he'd revealed that he tried to get Darren Aronofsky at that point interested in making X-Men 3. He'd just worked with him on The Fountain. Aronofsky would ultimately sign up to direct an X-Men film, The Wolverine, but then drop out. Aronofsky was also going to make the Batman reboot, Batman Year One as it was, but that never came to anything either. So with Aronofsky a non-starter, Singer out of the picture, Zack Snyder was next on the list before the word Snyder Cut had even been imagined. But at this stage, he was in the midst of making a small film by the name of 300, which would turn him into one of the hottest directors in Hollywood. Also on the list, Peter Berg of Friday Night Lights. He apparently turned the film down at that stage. Joss Whedon was reportedly sounded out, but at this stage he was trying to get his Wonder Woman project moving, and he would ultimately be unable to do that. There was then still some director toing and froing before Matthew Vaughn joined the production in March of 2005, and he was to be the new director of the film. Now at this stage there were negotiations with Halle Berry about reprising the role of Storm, because she was the cast member who was reluctant to return of the key members of the original ensemble for a variety of reasons. Number one, Storm hadn't actually been given an awful lot to do in the first two films, so she was concerned that her role had been quite minimal, and I think that's entirely fair. I mean, she's an Oscar-winning actor and a really terrific one. She also reportedly hadn't got on well with Singer at all, and so didn't really want to go back to work with him. And then she'd gone on to make the Catwoman movie, which hadn't really taken off. I think that would be fair to say. And so confluence of the change of director, Catwoman, and a rewrite that would beef up the role of Storm, well, that led to her getting interested again in making X-Men 3, and she was back, and ultimately she would get joint top billing on the film. Vaughn was on board the film for long enough to do some development work on it and also some casting work. So, for instance, Kelsey Grammer's casting the role of Beast, that was during Matthew Vaughn's tenure on the project. Likewise, Vaughn, who'd worked with Vinnie Jones on Lock, Stock, he was producer on that, would cast Vinnie Jones as Juggernaut in the movie. Grammer, incidentally, said that would say that he auditioned for the role. It was the first audition he'd done in about 2 decades, because he didn't really do auditions that much, but he really wanted the role that much that he was happy to go through the process. Vaughn also got writing work rewrite work done on the film, but I'm just going to alter the. I'm just going to go out of chronology just a minute. I'll come to that shortly, because with just weeks to go, I think it was 9 weeks to go before filming was due to start in June 2005, Matthew Vaughn suddenly quit what was then known as X-Men 3. That he'd directed Layer Cake. This was going to be a big step up, but the story, as reported at the time, was producer Avi Arad said, "This is not a case of creative differences. This is a personal decision by Matthew. I can tell you he's heartbroken. He loved this material and he wanted to make the film. And basically it was down to personal and professional reasons, were the given reasons, that he had to fly back from Hollywood to London and had to depart the movie. He would also raise concerns a little bit further down the line about just how short an amount of time he had to turn the film round. At the point in June 2005 when he departed the movie, there was less than a year until it was going to be released. The race was on to get this new X-Men film going. Fox then urgently needed another director. Alex Proyas was considered. He'd worked with Fox on the film I, Robot, starring Will Smith, but the reason Alex Proyas didn't want to do the film was he'd worked on the film I, Robot, starring Will Smith, and had found working with 20th Century Fox particularly difficult. It would be a non-starter for him. Ultimately, the choice of director was in part down to availability as well, but two directors were available who were of interest to Fox. One was Behind Enemy Lines director John Moore, who'd worked with the studio on a couple of projects, and the other was Brett Ratner. Ratner at this point, well, he was on an upward curve career-wise off the back of the Rush Hour films, and he would be the chosen director to take on X-Men 3 at very, very late notice. To say that his appointment was unpopular amongst fandom, that would be selling it a little short. At a point where the internet wasn't quite always as toxic as it tends to be now, there was significant backlash pretty much immediately from certain sectors of fandom. Hugh Jackman would describe in 2010, talking to The Telegraph, though, about Ratner, and it's fair to say he's also a director against whom very serious allegations have been made. I have to also cover myself and say these allegations have not been proven, and he has denied them, as is the case with Bryan Singer, but the allegations have nonetheless been made, and it's fair that I acknowledge those. Jackman would tell The Telegraph in 2010 that when he met Ratner, Ratner wanted to make 3 changes, and these were late in the day, remember. He said, quote, he said he wanted to make it a little funnier, a little sexier, and more emotional. So Jackman was happy to stay on. One person who wasn't at first, though, was Patrick Stewart in the role of Professor X, and he would, in a piece in Total Film around the time of the film's release, it was described that Patrick Stewart, quote, needed 2 long phone conversation with Ratner to convince him the movie was in safe hands, and at that stage there was a real question mark over the project. If Stewart hadn't signed up at that point, the new X-Men film would have been pretty much scuppered. Now, when Vaughn had come on, one thing he'd done was he'd been working with writers Simon Kinberg and Zach Penn on putting a new screenplay together. Now, the pair had originally been hired separately. It was a given studio thing. You get 2 different writers working on 2 different scripts, and you pick the better one, and it basically expedites the process. That's in theory. However, Zach Penn reached out to Simon Kinberg at the start of 2005 and just said, well, rather than us competing with each other, why don't we just pool our resources on it a bit? Penn had worked on the previous X-Men films and had kind of been beaten up by this process a bit, and the 2 of them decided to work together, but they had a lot of work to do very, very quickly, and they wrote very, very fast, and they came up with what was known as the 6-day draft. And it was known as this when the screenplay that they put together, and they put together something like 70-80 pages in their first week of working on it, they were going at that speed, leaked online a little bit later. Now, this leaked into a cauldron of already toxic fandom about the X-Men film, that there's a feeling that Ratner didn't necessarily have the subtlety to get across the undertones of what the first 2 X-Men films had built. Also, Kinberg and Penn were battling against pressure from the studio. I mean, at this stage, X-Men was Fox's big franchise and pretty much hinged its slate on the film happening. It wanted the film out in 2006 still. It wanted to beat Bryan Singer to the big screen. Went one story that Singer's Superman movie was coming, and damned if Fox was going to finish in second place in a race to get their film to cinemas. But Fox didn't want the film going too dark, and there were certain parameters that were put in place that Kinberg and Penn had to work with. And the fact they got any kind of screenplay together is a minor miracle in itself. It became known that certain characters were apparently not going to make it to the end credits as well, but again, there was kind of pushback from the studio on parts of that, and I don't think it's saying a lot, although I'm going as spoiler light as I can to say that there's a post-credit sequence that undoes some of the work that was done in the ultimate end feature. A post-credit sequence, incidentally, that was shot pretty much in secret with a very, very small crew, to the point where there's a whole veil of sequences secrecy over the plot and the story and the script for this one that all the cast had to adhere to, and in that case there were a significant number of people on the production who didn't even know that post-credits bit had been shot. One person who didn't return from the previous films was Alan Cumming in the role of Nightcrawler. He was set up to make a cameo appearance, but so extensive was the makeup work needed to get him into his Nightcrawler character that it was ultimately decided it was barely worth the expense of bringing him back for that. Because of the tight production as well and the change in the start production date that were happening on the movie, it was now clear that shooting was going to be in 2005, not as originally planned at the end of 2004. Well, that led to clashes for Rebecca Romijn and James Marsden, and the reason you get far less of the characters of Mystique and Cyclops in the film than originally planned was because the actors' availability had tailed off. Fox also put in a demand, reportedly, that because at this time it was also working on a Wolverine spin-off film, because it went into X-Men 3 thinking this is going to close the franchise off, this will be a complete trilogy of films, and thus we want whatever's going to be next. And so it put in place basically a ruling that if you're introducing new characters, they can't be in both films. So at that stage, the character of Gambit was planned for X-Men Origins Wolverine, which it would the film that would ultimately become. Keanu Reeves had been considered for Gambit at this stage, likewise Channing Tatum, but because of that ruling, Gambit was a non-starter for X-Men The Last Stand. Filming finally got going in August of 2005. So that's what 8-9 months late, really, beyond post the original plan. But also, more worryingly, that's 9-10 months before the film was due in cinemas, and Fox was not budging on that release date. Production took place in Canada, which is where the second movie had been shot, and the schedule was insane. I mean, it would film for the best part of 6 months. It wouldn't wrap up until January 2006 because this was an enormous movie. It was at the point too where there was so much visual effects work that needed to be done that as soon as sequences were shot, they were having to go straight into the post-production process just so they'd be ready for the edit in time. The demands were tough on the crew. The first director of photography, Philip Rousselot, he quit early on in the production to be replaced by Dante Spinotti, and Spinotti had a commitment as well, which meant that he wouldn't shoot the last week or two of the film because he had to go on to move on to the next movie. John Bruno, who directed a movie called Virus, remember that? He was overseeing the visual effects, and such was the intensity of the work required. He sent it to umpteen effects houses in different countries around the world, and it was his job to pull that together. And it's worth noting that X-Men The Last Stand was well ahead of Martin Scorsese's The Irishman in digitally de-aging characters. At the start of the film, we see the characters played by Professor X and Magneto, played by Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen, the twin Sirs, and they are presented much younger, courtesy of a computer program called Lola. But that took a lot of work as well. The film ultimately had a very, very tight post-production process, and the script leak exploded in the midst of all of this, and the fan pushback continued to build. And also in post-production, there were late story decisions made as well, because Fox got cold feet over its decision that this should be a trilogy closer, and as a consequence, scenes had to be rejigged very, very late in the day to basically leave story elements open, including that post-credit sequence. The role of Colossus was cut right down as well, and there was a lot of material that was intended for the movie that ultimately didn't make the final cut of it. By the time it did get to the end of its shoot, it's worth noting this as well, X-Men The Last Stand, as it had become known, was now the most expensive film of all time to make. It wouldn't hold that record for long, but it's worth just noting that it was the most expensive film of all time. Its production budget would come in at $210 million, and that's even before the extensive marketing campaign and the promotions. I mean, the marketing was starting just 2 months after the film started shooting. So in October 2005, up popped a website, but the first trailer was released for Christmas of 2005, and there was still an awful long way of the film to go at that stage. The film ultimately, it premiered at the Cannes Film Festival on May the 22nd, 2006. And compared to the strong response to the first two films, the critical reaction this time wasn't as strong. That said, I think it's worth noting it was nowhere near as hostile as is sometimes put across. That amongst fandom there was a lot of pushback for the film, but the response amongst the general public, the general less nerdy elements of the general public, it was a bit warmer, really, and the film was really quite well received and did really strong business as well. It opened in the US to $102 million for its opening weekend. It set new box office records. They wouldn't last for long because the Pirates of the Caribbean sequel would come along a few weeks later. But this was an enormous instant success. The film would go on to gross worldwide $460 million, which doesn't seem an awful lot by context of today's money. It was at that point, but also it's worth noting that until X-Men Days of Future Past came along, which brought Bryan Singer back to the franchise, this would be the highest grossing X-Men film of the lot of them. Arguably the least liked, although X-Men Origins Wolverine has quite a lot of critics. But this was nonetheless the most successful, just in terms of box office takings. The Golden Gate sequence in the film alone, just to give this some context, and an extensive Golden Gate sequence that Ratner moved to the end of the movie, it had originally been in the middle, cost about half of what the first X-Men film did, just in its own right. Following X-Men The Last Stand, Fox would pursue its plan for standalone X-Men movies. It planned X-Men Origins Wolverine, X-Men Origins Magneto. Only Wolverine would happen, and ironically Matthew Vaughn would come back to the X-Men franchise for the soft reboot X-Men First Class, which would be an even tighter turnaround, really. He would realise that film in less than a year from start to finish. I've covered that in a previous podcast. The abandoned Dark Phoenix storyline that was intended to be the front and centre of Last Stand and was watered down heavily, that would ultimately surface in 2019's X-Men Dark Phoenix, directed by Simon Kinberg. Again, a story for a future podcast. That didn't quite work out as planned. Singer would be lured back and would come back to 20th Century Fox to make two more X-Men films. And it's worth noting too that in 2009 he would admit that he made a mistake turning down Superman for turning down X-Men 3 to go and make Superman. But I'll come to the story of Superman Returns in a future podcast. In more recent years, Ellen Page has opened up about alleged homophobic bullying she experienced on the set of X-Men The Last Stand that she alleges from Brett Ratner, and there is a little bit of an unpleasant taste about some of the people who were involved in this movie, and it's gone on really, I'd suggest, to live as part of a box set more than as a much loved movie in its own right. I still don't see an awful lot of affection towards the film. And when you set it against the ambition of something like Logan, then clearly it's far less ambitious than the first two X-Men films, and also several of the ones that followed. But it exists, it's there, it got made, it got turned around in a very, very quick time frame. It could have been very different, but then that's not the only film I've covered in this series of podcasts to which that label could apply. Which means I've come to the end now of the latest episode. You can find me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. It covers our print magazine. A new issue is on sale now. You can find details of that at www.filmstories.co.uk. It covers a YouTube channel, youtube.com/filmstories. We put bits and bobs up there. A daily weekday, every weekday we update our website with features and news. That's at the aforementioned web address. you can find us too on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. But as always, I waffled too much. I've been trying to get these podcasts shorter. I'll have another go at that next week. But for now, I'll leave you in peace. Thank you so much for all your support. Thank you for listening. You all take care. I'll be back soon with some more film stories. Bye bye.